The conference room at the Munich Security Conference fell into an uncomfortable silence. It was February 23, and Christiane Amanpour had just finished moderating a panel on Middle Eastern regional security when a respected German diplomat approached her during the coffee break. His question was delivered with the kind of practiced diplomatic precision that barely concealed genuine bewilderment and deep discomfort. Christiane, how do we reconcile Israel's democratic values with its security policies? It seems like such a fundamental and troubling contradiction. She had heard variations of this exact question thousands of times over her long decades covering the complex Middle East, but something about his urgent tone struck her very differently this particular time. It wasn't simply confusion. It was the kind of existential discomfort that comes from encountering something that doesn't fit neatly into one's worldview. This question, she realized, revealed far more about the questioner than about Israel itself. It exposed a deeply embedded Western assumption that democracy and security exist in separate, incompatible universes, that a nation must choose between moral purity and survival. But what if this assumption is wrong? What if the story we tell ourselves about Israel, the story of a contradiction wrapped in a paradox, is actually a story about our own inability to confront the uncomfortable realities of modern statecraft? For decades, Western observers have approached Israel through a lens of moral binaries. They see a nation that claims to share their values while acting in ways that make them deeply uncomfortable. They witness a democracy that builds walls, a liberal society that maintains occupation, a modern state that seems perpetually at war with its neighbors. The cognitive dissonance is overwhelming, and the Western response has been predictable. Either Israel is the victim of circumstances beyond its control, or it has betrayed the very principles it claims to uphold. But this binary thinking misses the most important part of the story. Israel is neither victim nor betrayer. It is a mirror. It reflects back to the West uncomfortable truths about the nature of modern democracy, the relationship between liberty and security, and the psychological price of survival in an uncertain world. The reason Western discussions about Israel generate such heat and so little light is that they are not really about Israel at all. They are about the West's confrontation with its own future. To understand this mirror effect, we must first examine what the West sees when it looks at Israel. The image is fragmented, contradictory, and deeply unsettling. On one side, there is the Israel of the Western imagination, the startup nation, the only democracy in the Middle East, the beacon of progress surrounded by authoritarianism. This Israel validates Western assumptions about the superiority of liberal values and democratic institutions. It suggests that Western civilization can thrive anywhere, under any conditions. On the other side, there is the Israel that makes Western liberals deeply uncomfortable, the Israel of checkpoints and settlements, of military operations and civilian casualties, of a society that seems to have chosen security over human rights. This Israel challenges fundamental Western beliefs about the compatibility of democracy and moral behavior. It suggests that perhaps the choice between survival and principle is not as clear-cut as Western political theory would have us believe. The Western response to this contradiction has been to fragment Israel into good and bad parts. The innovative, democratic Israel versus the militaristic, occupying Israel. This fragmentation allows Western observers to maintain their moral framework while engaging with a reality that defies easy categorization. They can celebrate Israeli technology while condemning Israeli military policy, support Israeli democracy while opposing Israeli security measures. But this fragmented view reveals more about Western psychology than about Israeli reality. It exposes a deep, almost pathological Western need to believe that moral clarity is possible in complex geopolitical situations, that democratic values can be maintained without any moral compromise whatsoever. The inability to see Israel as a coherent whole reflects the Western difficulty in confronting the integrated nature of survival and values in an uncertain, often hostile world. Consider the Western reaction to Israel's security barrier. Built in response to suicide bombings that killed over 1,000 Israeli civilians, the barrier dramatically reduced terrorist attacks by over 90%. But yet, Western criticism focused almost exclusively on its impact on Palestinian movement rather than its security function. This response reveals a fundamental disconnect between theoretical morality and practical security. Western observers, living in societies where systematic terrorism is largely theoretical, could afford to prioritize moral optics over security function. They had the luxury of focusing on principle because they had not experienced the specific existential threat the barrier addressed. Israel offers a different model: democracy under pressure, liberalism under siege, Western values in a non-Western environment. It demonstrates what happens when the theoretical becomes practical, when the philosophical becomes existential, when moral purity meets survival necessity. The Israeli experience reveals uncomfortable truths about democracy that Western theory prefers to ignore. It shows that democratic societies can support policies that liberal theorists consider illiberal. It demonstrates that democratic publics can prioritize security over rights when facing existential threats. This suggests the relationship between democratic values and democratic behavior is more complex than Western political science acknowledges. These questions become uncomfortable when we consider Western society's trajectory. As immigration increases, terrorism becomes frequent, inequality grows, and social cohesion weakens. Western democracies face pressures Israel has confronted for decades. The rise of populist movements, surveillance states, and political polarization suggest the West is moving toward the Israeli model rather than away from it. The Western reaction to Israeli surveillance technology illustrates this perfectly. Israel's terrorism experience has made it a world leader in monitoring and prevention technologies. These are now exported globally, often to the same Western countries that criticize Israeli security policies. The contradiction is striking. Western governments purchase Israeli surveillance technology, while Western civil society condemns Israeli surveillance practices. Western societies benefit from Israeli security innovations, while Western intellectuals question Israeli commitment to civil liberties. Israel serves as both the source of technologies, enabling this trade-off, and the scapegoat for the moral discomfort it creates. This reveals the gap between Western theory and practice. In theory, Western societies remain committed to privacy and limited government. In practice, they increasingly trade these values for security. Israel becomes both model and mirror for this uncomfortable evolution. The psychological dimension offers perhaps the most challenging reflection. Living under constant threat has shaped Israeli culture in ways Western observers find both fascinating and disturbing. Israelis have developed what psychologists call post-traumatic growth, extracting strength from traumatic experiences. But this has produced characteristics Western observers find uncomfortable. Fatalism about conflict, skepticism about international promises, willingness to act preemptively. These reflect adaptation to an environment where stakes are existential and margins for error small. They represent rational responses to irrational circumstances, but they challenge Western assumptions about the psychological requirements of democratic citizenship. Western democratic theory assumes citizens will be optimistic, trusting of institutions, willing to resolve conflicts peacefully. These assumptions work in secure environments where democratic institutions prove effective and existential threats are rare. But what happens when assumptions break down? The Western response to populism, polarization, and breakdown of social trust suggests Western societies are beginning to confront these questions. The Israeli experience offers both warning and potential model, showing democratic societies can adapt and survive under pressure. But adaptation comes with psychological and moral costs. The mirror that Israel holds up to the West is uncomfortable precisely because it is accurate. It reflects not what the West wants to be, but what the West is becoming. Societies forced to balance idealistic values with harsh realities. Democratic institutions operating under pressure. Liberal principles tested by existential challenges. As Western societies face increasing pressure from terrorism, immigration, technological disruption, and global competition, they are discovering that the luxury of moral purity might be a luxury they can no longer afford. The Israeli experience suggests that democracy and security are not incompatible, but their relationship is more complex and fraught than Western theory acknowledges. The question facing Western societies is not whether they will become more like Israel, but whether they can learn from Israel's experience while avoiding its mistakes, whether they can maintain their core values while adapting to new realities, whether they can look in the mirror without turning away in discomfort. The alternative, refusing to acknowledge these uncomfortable truths, may prove far more dangerous than confronting them.